eventually come past its own right.
So, Kirby, welcome. And we don't have a specific bill in front of us. We've been looking at three bills. We've been talking about current use. We've been learning more about where the formula comes from, who's eligible. And we've been talking also about what happens if you withdraw from current use. And we've come across a couple of situations that seem a little odd. I think that we wonder why there would be a penalty applied in certain situations. And I wanted to give the committee an opportunity to talk more about that, see whether there are specific things that we wanted to maybe look at drafting changes to that might fit in easily to one of the bills that we've got, or could be in a separate bill, I suppose, too. So that's sort of what I'm hoping to do over of course the next few minutes anyway. And I don't know if anybody wants to jump in here. I will just remind the committee that yesterday, I think it was yesterday, we had testimony from a landowner who grows grapes and presented a scenario that seemed counterintuitive, that that couldn't have been really what we intended when we passed this.
I love that Kirby explained that to us. He grew grapes on rented land, 48-acre parcel. The land and he was growing on 13 acres. Roughly.
That's right, yeah.
So the landowner split off the 13 acres without penalty. And the gentleman kept growing his grapes, and the other piece of land was 25 acres, correct? No, 35 acres. So that land would have no penalty. And then they bought the land. Now it'd been consistently being farmed. And we know that you make more than $3,000 off the land, you are not, you're still in current use. But they have taxed him. They've charged him the separation fee. And now with penalty and interest, because he's appealing it. And they said, well, you can reapply to get into current use, but why would you have to pay that separation or anything if it hasn't, there's no buildings, it's still doing as is, as was.
So I'm not familiar with all the facts of this case, and it sounds like there's litigation going on, so I should be careful around that anyway. And I'm sure the department would have to be careful talking about it because of that as well. So I can just try to give some info that might inform maybe something that happened there. Okay, so when it comes to withdrawals and the way that the land use change tax works is there's two ways that you can kind of start the land use change tax process. One is if development occurs. And in that case, the way the law is set up, PBR is to say, development occurred, you owe land use change tax right now, and this can't be enrolled. And so that's one path that it goes on. The other path, which I think is far more typical, is someone decides to just withdraw and their land, and maybe because they're planning to develop it, or maybe they're planning to give it away, or they're lots of different reasons, right? And in that case, land use change tax does not due right away necessarily. It could be paid, but it's not. Because when you enroll in current use, a lien goes on the land and it runs with the land. And that is the way that the state can be absolutely certain we're going to get our money eventually, because that lien's not going anywhere. That title is going to be encumbered until you pay us what you owe us from the land use change tax. So in that case, it's not set up so that you have a landowner has to pay when they withdraw. They can wait. And I think you've heard about that, right, before. In this case, given the circumstances, I don't know all the facts, but it sounds a lot more like the development or like development happened. The term development might not be intuitive. It doesn't necessarily mean you're paving everything or whatever. There's a definition of development in the current use chapter. It has, it's A through F. So that's 6 different definitions of development. The construction of any building, road, or other structure, mining, excavation, landfill, also means the subdivision of a parcel of land into 2 or more parcels, regardless of whether a change of use actually occurred. Where 1 or more of the resulting parcels contains less than 25 acres, that sounds like this scenario too. But if subdivision is solely the result of a transfer to 1 or more of, and this is like family members, like, non-arm's length transactions, then development shall not apply. And there might be something about it. Yeah, divorce settlement, which I think is fairly new. I don't think that that's always been in there. So you see it's getting very complicated. And we just went through the first 2. There's 4 more after that. These were policy decisions that were made by the General Assembly at some point saying, we don't want this land subdivided. These definitions are set up to encourage and to discourage certain behavior. It sounds like that's what got caught up in the scenario, but I don't know all the specifics and the nitty-gritty stuff with that, but that's what it sounds like when you describe it. That development happened, and when development happened, land use change tax became due then, and that sounds like what is happening. And it's a situation where like you pay for the development that happened because the law says so, and maybe you can just go ahead and enroll again, because it wasn't the kind of development that made it impossible to continue to qualify for current use. It was just, but technically, according to the law, development happened. Does that make sense?
But you still have to pay the fee? Can you just enroll and not have to pay the fee? I mean, 10%.
It's when development happens, land use change tax becomes due, so it has to be paid, as opposed to just when you withdraw land and you owe land use change tax potentially, but you can wait in that case. But it becomes due with development.
We've heard from this witness who did his best, I think, to describe his understanding of the situation, and committee can jump in here if you heard differently, but I think that the explanation was that the owner had passed away and that family members who inherited the property then subdivided it, but maybe the subdivision occurred before that death. That then some time went by, and then they sold the parcel that was being used for growing grapes, and that
But no change of use.
no change of use, or at least as we would understand it.
Yeah, I've had several personal experiences that include a lot line adjustment, no change in use. That's a case of subdivision. Whether you transfer, it stays in the same ownership. Every new lot or even an adjustment of the line is considered a case of development. And I pushed back, didn't matter. I had a parcel that I bought separately, was added. Just adding it, the town added it because it was ag land. Them adding that new parcel to it was another case of development. So no change of ownership, no change of use. And in a period of 4 years, I'd already developed 5 lots, hadn't done taxes.
Greg,
Do you know
the witness that was in here, did they say that that they re-enrolled it into current or attempted to
Yeah,
re-enroll it in current
we-
use when they took over ownership of the property?
We asked that, and I think the answer was that because they were currently embroiled in this dispute, that they had held off on re-enrolling, but they planned to, and that there was no reason why they wouldn't be able to, as far as that person knew.
Just wondering if that was what triggered the issue in the first place. Yeah, if any transfer of land, even if it was in current use by the previous owner, you have to enroll in current
Re-enroll,
use.
yeah. That didn't seem to be the case, but that it did, yes. It was a good question. John?
And they're probably not in good standing now too, right? And then it's working its way through the appeals process and they owe money, so.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you gotta be in good shape.
Well, if you go 30 days out after you purchase it and you haven't enrolled in current, you lose it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So there could be circumstances that we're not familiar with, but I wanted to go back, John, and I'll just, but before I forget, as you were reading through, I think the second of the definitions there, you mentioned that if the subdivision had to do with transfer within the family, which seems to have been the case here possibly, that would have been grounds for an exemption.
So it says, if subdivision is solely the result of a transfer to one or more of a spouse, ex-spouse in a divorce settlement, parent, grandparent, child, grandchild, niece, nephew, or sibling of the transferor, or to the surviving spouse of any of the foregoing, then development shall not apply to any portion of the newly created parcel or parcels that qualify for enrollment and for which within 30 days, I think was just mentioned, following the transfer, each transferee or transferor applies to re-enroll.
What if there's no relative involved, but I just own 50 acres and I decide that I want to subdivide it into two lots? One of them is 13 and one is, the balance. Does that trigger development?
Yes.
Right, so the subdivision would have to be, and I'm going to transfer ownership of one of those to one of those family members to be exempt, qualified.
But if you were farming that, it wouldn't be developed. He has 50 acres of farmland, divides it into two parcels, one's less than 25. He would have to maybe re-enroll, but it's not considered development because it's in the family. That's what came up with this.
Well, if it was just me, though, are you talking
Or
about?
yeah, well, yours.
That's
right.
one question I would have with the just me scenario.
Yeah.
Would be I would want to check to see if other Vermont laws allow that. Like I'm not sure, but yeah, if I think things may have changed, but I'm trying to draw off of memories of working on property tax stuff 15 years ago, and I think that if two parcels are contiguous and they have the same exact ownership, then they're considered the same parcel. So I'm not sure that you can subdivide and you could there could be some legal tricks. You could create an LLC that holds one of them. That's basically you. And then you could personally hold the other one. You could get around it, but yeah, so I just want to throw that out there.
Interesting, very interesting.
And we also heard from our witness that if the subdivision had been 25 acres or greater, development wouldn't have been a factor either, even though it was changing ownership. But
Yeah,
because it was under, right?
That is part of the definition that I was reading from is one of the provisions there is where one or more of the resulting parcels contains less than 25 acres each.
Okay.
So there's a lot of parts to that, but once it gets hit, land use change taxes due.
So you're more into the tax part of it. The evidence behind 134 was to remove barriers for development of workforce housing or affordable housing. Okay, it was so you could, if you were close to village services and whatnot,
Mhm.
you could take a part of a field out, not and develop it for affordable workforce housing. You know, then I started hearing the numbers, 10%. I'm like, well, it's not such a great barrier to workforce housing. It, you know, if it's a smooth process, you know, even if you were to get 20,000 an acre and they were splitting it in two, making two lots, that's only $4,000 additional. And then it dawned on me yesterday in hearing this stuff, it's a prime ag value land. You know, if they take it, the prime ag value, and it gets tripled, that is added on, or that's a fee against
Act 250.
Act 250. Are you familiar with that?
I don't primarily look at 250.
I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to either.
No, it seems fun. It's Ellen, and it seems like, stuff
Yeah.
sounds really fun. But
Yeah, that,
not me.
that's where we worked it with Ellen. So, I mean, looking at that, it's almost like this bill needs more work. I don't know. I'm looking for advice from you folks in here, and I sent a text to Charlie Kimball, and he says, well, it's out of my ballgame.
Yeah.
You know, but if it's something that needs to stay there, then keep working it for next year to put in that piece of the prime ag. And I understand why we have the prime ag restrictions. But it is a barrier towards development on these pieces of property that people need. You know, we do need to grow our economy. And as my father always said, get the price of milk high enough, there's no one going to develop prime ag land because they're not going to be able to afford to buy it.
Greg, did you have your hand
Yeah, so. This is the first time I've heard about the prime ag soil thing from Richard. I'd like to hear more on that if possible, to understand that. From what you're saying, so there's more fees associated. Simply
Yeah.
because it's prime ag and that triggers something with Act 250?
Yeah, and so they can charge 3 times the value,
Mitigation.
triple value.
Yeah.
And there's some that's even higher than that. Now, I did hear, I think from Mr. O'Grady today that, well, if you're in zone 1 or 1B of the new Act 250, that's waived. Tier 1, 1B, thank you.
I mean, it won't be.
Yeah, there are actually, I think, a bunch of exceptions. If you're in a town with zoning, if the parcel is less than 10 acres, then
Yeah.
it's exempt, it's not considered. But in any case, back to the scenario that we heard about. It sounds like possibly if the land was subdivided, that before it was sold, that it was subdivided and a family member took a piece of it for some reason, and that didn't trigger, but then it was triggered when.
Yeah.
So.
I again, I don't know all the facts, but I think it's foreseeable and something for you to think about is, as we run through this, we see it's complicated.
Yeah.
And people need legal assistance probably if they're really going to try to do something complicated and make sure that it goes their way. And there's a lot of ways you take the wrong turn, make a wrong decision, and owe a lot of money when you could have done it a different way, maybe not. And so I think that is something to think about. And I talk about with tax policy a lot is, what are the transaction costs, which is like a phrase in economics of what are the things that the law is making people jump through hoops and learn about and spend all this time on? Because in economics, you recognize that stuff affects the economy, that's people having to do stuff. And that's the equivalent of having them pay taxes or have So so simplifying these things can have some policy value. That's not, it's not even a partisan type thing. It's like, if we can be more efficient and get the same results, then why not, right? So I think that is something to think about. Generally, I try to, when I work on tax stuff, I do keep in mind, like, people shouldn't have to go lawyer up to navigate our systems. And this is one where there's a lot of complexity here. So I would make that point in the context of this conversation.
And it's, so the 25 acre, the more than 25 acre and the less than 25 acre, I think that in itself doesn't create complexity, but the rules for a smaller than 25 acre parcel, I think, are complex, and maybe just having the distinction here was enough of a, he wasn't expecting it, clearly wasn't expecting it. Do you know, Kirby, enough to say why we have that distinction between parcels greater than 25 and less than 25? Why that number?
I mean, I think it goes back a ways, right? Like, that decision was made a while ago. So I would have to guess, and I think it is that in land use policy, you want to see large tracts of forest land and farmland, and so giving this benefit of current use, which is a large benefit, there's, I'm guessing, policy-wise in the past, folks in this building, some of them probably weren't that comfortable with spending the state money on small tracts that aren't contributing in the same way to the policy behind it as the big ones. And they want to make it harder, and they want to make more hoops, and because they don't want that. I mean, that's the way I read it too. Like why it's harder. It's to keep large forest lands and large ag land, parcels.
How long have we had these kind of policies of current use? I mean, are we talking like 100 years or 20 years? I mean, I'm just wondering if there might be a difference, like if, when it originally came in, if it was people needed more acreage to have their sheep graze or something, as opposed to now we have people doing specialty farming on smaller plots. I mean, the nature of agriculture is changing, and maybe it seems to me, maybe it's time that we update that.
Yeah, it was in the 70s.
Yeah, I have the law pulled up here. Added 1977, Act 236, Section 1.
Thanks. Almost 50 years.
And you're exactly right. It was, back then, there was over 3,000 dairy farms in the state of Vermont. And it was to remove the tax pressure, making farmers slowly bleeding their farms off, selling 10 acres, 5 acres at a time. And there wasn't, people garden then, they gardened on their farms, that you're well aware of. There wasn't all this other types of agriculture in the state, really. Farmers markets weren't really a thing then.
Interstate changed our world.
Yeah.
It did.
I would add to the question there, just to give you some more background info. Pretty much every state has some type of use value appraisal. So it's just like a land use policy thing that's like across the country to recognize that usually property valuations based on highest and best use, but if you can't throw strip malls up on everywhere, because then you're not going to have farming, you're not going to have food, right? So like that's why,
But are they all biased towards bigger plots as opposed to smaller plots, if you're still talking about the current use of agriculture?
There's different rules throughout. I would say, speaking very generally, Vermont is one of the only, if not the only, that's running this whole program on the state level. Most places it's like a county thing or towns, and there's it's more of a local thing. It's having the state run it in Vermont is because Vermont's small population wise, there's a few areas. This isn't the only one where like the state's running something as opposed to because like a medium sized US city has the same population that our state, so that's part of it. But the state runs it. I think that the people who like the think tanks on land use policy tend to say, this is what Vermont's doing is great. It's, because if you had it on the local level, there could be inconsistencies and so great in the way that our program does protect and preserve the land that we're trying to, like it's successful in doing what it wants to do. So it is a little different. But yeah, I think some think tanks would call our system a model. That doesn't mean that necessarily our definitions of development and stuff are perfect. But yeah, so I don't know. That's kind of what I'm aware of how Vermont's seen.
You were able to look up and see that it was 1977 when it was first enacted.
And yeah, and I think Representative Lipsky is correct that it was put in the law in 77, so it would become effective
A year later. Yeah. So now we know today anyway, that forest land has to be 25 acres. There is no under 25, I think it qualifies. Was on the ag side, the ag piece, originally that way as well? And was there anything that was added at some point, or from the get-go, were we allowing, in some cases, a smaller than 25 acre lot to be?
I would have to go and do some digging on that. I think I might be able to figure out when certain changes took place. I think there's no doubt that there's been a lot of changes over time. Just looking at just the definitions themselves, there were changes. It was put in the law in 77. There were changes in 81, multiple changes in 81, 83, 87, 87, 87, 95, 98. I'm sure that if I look back, I told you there's 6 different ways that development's defined. Some of those are probably newer and weren't the originals. So it's certainly evolved over time. The 25 acres specifically, yeah, I'd have to dig into to see how that's changed over time.
I can imagine that at one point, the legislature somewhere down the road said, oh, we do have smaller farms that we'd like to have qualify in some way. Just, it seems much more complicated, the under 25 acre piece of it, though. John?
Yeah, but along those lines too, what's the policy part of it, that it's a land use policy. And here's, we value agriculture no matter sort of what scale it's on, and the law reflected that. And so, here's a case where the land use never changed, and yet it's considered development. And I think that's issues.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe we can just ask you, Kirby, to help us with this yourself, or to consult with Mike O'Grady and figure out what the next step might be. But I think, to your point, so it seems like there's an unfairness question there, and a policy, unintended policy, and also creates a complication and a transaction cost that ideally wouldn't be there. Just the fact that I suppose there might have been somebody who, if we're understanding the scenario correctly, would have said, okay, written the check and been done with it. But now there's litigation, there's, angst, all of that. So if there's a way to, that we can look at language that would change this situation without opening up a large can of worms, that would be great.
So some things come to mind. So I just asked you if you're interested in different paths here. Like, first off, are you interested in, this would be the bigger one, maybe the can of worms you just mentioned, but in something to the effect of land use change tax does not immediately become due on development, or like to try to build some, as long as it's qualifies and is re-enrolled the next amount of time, like that kind of thing, as a safety valve, or changing this definition we were looking at, it would be another way to soften up some of the difficulties there, or simplify that definition. Like, between those two, say, which of the ones you think you're thinking about?
Greg, you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, we'll Well, based on my experience, like, the big thing is having to re-enroll within 30 days. If you don't have that knowledge, which kind of sounds like maybe that was the case with these folks that came in yesterday. Because I've had a couple pieces of land I bought that's like, it's, making sure that that happens. It seems like if the process was, instead of you had to reach out to current use and initiate that process, if they initiated it for the landowner. So, they could send in something to say, hey, this is what we have on this piece of land from the prior owner. Can you basically help people walk through that process a little more? Like, this is what we had from before. This is what you need to do in order to stay enrolled, instead of automatically being,
How would the department know a transfer happened?
what's that?
Like you're saying that the PBR, the Department of Taxes, would reach out proactively?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
They have a lien on the property.
Like that might be possible through like property transfer tax return that was filed or something. Unless there was but I think you would want to hear from them to know like whether they think they could reasonably actually be able to be proactive in that area or not. But
Yeah.
so I'm not trying to shoot down your idea.
No, yeah, no,
I'm just
I'm trying to-
pointing out like how are we gonna navigate that?
So how does that work, given that they already have a lien on the property? I'm not saying if it's already in current use, which in this case it was, and it's the land is transferred.
Mhm.
That means it's in the system. The land has a lien on it
Mhm.
from current use. What would be the normal process if you are like a mortgage lender? You have a lien on the property. Did they get notified normally when transfer happens? I would assume.
Oh, yeah.
Your attorney would make sure that that happens.
Yeah. So if there's a lien, it just seems like it's not a clear, it's like.
I'm just wondering like when the department like could you consistently rely on the department knowing that transfer happened? Eventually, sure.
It just
They
seems to
might
be like
figure it out.
Somehow be a part of the process anyway, if they,
Yeah.
it's considered a lien.
I don't know. Yeah. I think it would be good to ask PBR about that.
And it sounds like in this scenario, possibly at the closing, there wasn't a conversation about there's going to be a large bill coming due.
$14,000 bill.
Who's going to pay that bill?
That may or may not happen in the real world. When it comes to I think that there's a lot of stuff in our law where we don't address potential problems because of a reliance on, at closing, the attorneys will take care of it. I know in the real world, I've seen situations where, like one example, is property taxes and there's a property tax credit and there's a transfer and the seller had a credit. The buyer doesn't know necessarily whether to negotiate for that credit. And on top of that, it's even possible that the buyer isn't, if it's at the right time of year, there could be property taxes that are coming due and the seller doesn't hand over that property tax bill either. So there's multiple ways that a buyer, if they're not informed at the time of closing, could end up being late on their property taxes or owing more than they needed to. And sometimes those things don't get worked out.
Yeah, it's almost like. First of all, I think Greg's bill, the one that you have about the 6% and whatnot, be a good one to really dig into this on. But we could have Ellen come back in and drop a scenario. Here you go, here's the scenario, block that, how does it go forward? So we're informed on how the process works. I know we just bought the farm from Dad and, the lawyers were handling everything. 900 acres got missed.
Ouch.
A real world scenario.
Yeah.
John?
Did you ever find it?
Can we change
Came with the tax bill.
the statute so that it just says change in ownership of continuous agricultural land shall not constitute development.
Yeah, I mean, I can look into that. I need to read through, more of it, but I understand what you're saying. Just adding a provision that's blanket across the board. That something to the effect of if the only change being made is a change in ownership,
Well, subdivision,
but it,
going to ownership and continuing the same use.
yeah, I could think about that. That might amount to the same thing as just deleting some of these requirements and this, but I would need to look more closely at that. But I understand that that's what you're looking for and you'd like to have language along those
And
lines.
you just, off the top of your head, suggested, a couple of different directions we could go. And I'm not sure that I feel like that I understand the implications well enough to say go that direction. But if you think that there are, and maybe this is the third direction, options that we could consider, maybe that would be, if we could look at those a little more deeply,
Okay.
Michelle.
So one of the things that was mentioned was that if you subdivide the land and it's a family member, then there isn't a penalty. So in the case that we became aware of yesterday, the reason there's a penalty is because the person that's been farming the land has been renting it. They're not a family member. When they officially divide it and they're buying it, now they have to pay. And so, I mean, I personally would be okay with changing the law to be, if it's in continuous use of agriculture, that it's either it's going to have a modified rate or it won't have that same level of rate. Because the truth is, like in a situation like we heard yesterday, if nobody chooses to farm that land because it's so expensive and it comes with a $15,000 tax bill before you can even start on it, and it's so hard to make a living as a farmer, it's really a deterrent to keeping the land in current use. And it doesn't make sense if it's okay for the family member to do it. It should be okay for the farmer who's been renting it for many years, who's trying to buy it, to also do it without having a penalty. Like, to me, that's the part that makes sense, is that, not just that we were making policy around one case, but I'm quite sure there are other situations where this has come up for people. And it feels fair to me that we look out for smaller farmers who don't need 25 acres and don't happen to be a family member, but want to own the land that they're working on. That feels reasonable.
No, it could be a commercial dairy farmer that's buying a chunk of land too, that's smaller than 20, just keep it rolling. It's open, it's being farmed. That's the whole issue. Whether it's a vinter or llamas, even a sheep.
It's just, right, the definition of development makes no sense in this case, because it's like, I'm a vinter, right? I have a vineyard that I'm running. It's on rented land. Oh, now I bought it. Nothing's changed.
It's not developed.
Now, according to the tax department, it's developed.
A little paved road or cellar hole's been put in it.
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, he hasn't built a winery. He hasn't put up a wedding pavilion and any of these things.
We've had a couple of conversations with the tax department about the delay on paying the penalty if you take your land, if you unenroll your land, so for a larger parcel, greater than 25, if you decide you're not going to farm it anymore, take it out, but lien stays on, you don't have to pay as long as you don't actually develop it. And we've had, as I say, we've had a couple of conversations to try and get some clarity. I think my understanding is that is the case for a parcel that's greater than 25 acres, but it is not the case for a smaller parcel. And I wanted to just bring that up too, because we've heard not directly testimony, but anecdotally, but from Vermonters today who have parcels that are smaller than 25 acres who have been farming it, can no longer farm it because they've reached a point in their lives where physically it's not feasible. They're not intending to develop it. It hasn't been developed, but pulling it out of current use in that scenario would require them to pay that penalty immediately, just because it's less than 25 acres. So I don't know whether I'm understanding that correctly, but if I am, I think that's another thing we've heard and would like to, maybe think about.
My understanding is that it's not like it's not a setup where if it's 25 acres or less, it's just, and you withdraw it, that's automatically like different. It could be that that's combined with some of these definitions of development.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably a more nuanced thing. I think the general rule is if you're withdrawing the land but not developing it, the lien's sitting there, but you don't have to pay. The thing that's triggering payment is if you do one of those things that count as development.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, great, yeah, if we can zero in on what that is and figure out if there's a way to think a little bit more about that and whether it's doing what we want to be doing or whether it's doesn't seem to be serving a useful purpose. And again, trying to, with any of these changes, just also think about what unintended consequences that we want to, avoid.
David, it seems to me that I remember when the 25 acre rule, particularly with forests, because there were a lot of people had a nice house. Maybe it was a permanent residence, whatever, and a portion was forested. And they wanted to put the whole state in current use so as to reduce the tax burden. And that was very common all over Vermont. But that's why active forest management, which were the 25 acre as a minimum, particularly for the forest use, was critical to have a forest management plan. But with ag, it's a very different thing. As we've discovered, we want to encourage the smaller farm option and give some tax benefit to that. So I don't think there's any, that's what we ought to be focusing on, the agricultural current use policy. Just a thought, context.
So does this all more or less make sense, Kirby?
Well, so far, I'm aware that you'd like to look at language for one thing. So let me know if there's more than.
Okay.
And that one thing being a way to allow a subdivision as long as there's no change of use. Is that?
I think, yeah, and we can see if that then we can talk more about whether that gets at what we want to do, but I think it does. Then a second thing would be if we could look at this scenario that I've just described, where there is a change of use in that the farmer is no longer farming, but hasn't developed it in the everyday sense of what that word means, and would not have to pay the penalty for a 26 acre piece of land, but would have to pay it for a 24 acre piece of land. If that's the case, looking at that and possibly changing that so that the size of the parcel there is not, the deterrent.
Okay. Okay.
Last, kind of hopefully clarifying question. So we were talking about the 30-day period where you need to make sure you enroll in current use after you bought a piece of property that may or may not have been in current use before that qualifies for current use. Say somebody sells off a piece that is less than 25 acres, and it will no longer qualify for current use. It's definitely development, right? to somebody else. How do the folks at current use know? How are they made aware? Because this would be the other end of the spectrum where, for, the penalty that would be paid on that piece of property. Is it the realtors, the lawyers that are involved are supposed to notify current use to make that happen? Or could it potentially sell off 2 acres of land? And the folks at current use don't even get notified, and it's like decades of nobody having to pay the penalty.
I think this is a good question, and I don't have all the answer for that. If there's going to be a tattletale, it might be the lister. Maybe. But they, what I think we can safely assume is that the PVR does not have the resources to go out and be checking on these, like driving around looking. Like that's not what's happening. But how do they tend to find out when something's happened? It's a good question for them, I think, and it's probably various ways.
I guess I could, I'm just curious generally, any entity that has a lien on property, how do they get notified once?
Oh, I mean, that's easy. That's I can answer that. Like, when you buy land, if you're using an attorney, one of their jobs is to make sure the title's clean. Like that's like why, like, so, and then that lien is going to be obvious and show up and like not going to be missed. So that's how you find out as the buyer. It's possible, but like if 2 people, cash changing hands, nobody gets a lawyer, and then maybe somebody could accidentally buy a parcel that has a current use lien and they just bought themselves a whole bunch of non-use change tax debt.
Which I don't think now is pretty state law that you have to use, lawyers have to be involved in the transaction of a property, right? No? You don't need that.
That's not an area I work in a ton, so I don't know. But I think that it does happen when people don't get lawyers and problems happen.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, yeah, it's checking out on the title is like what the lawyer would do in the transaction. So the buyer's gonna know that that's there. And if you have a lender or mortgage, whatever, then like that institution will also be aware that that's there. And you may have trouble finding if you're trying to buy a property that's subject to a lien, that's gonna matter to a financial institution.
We heard testimony from PVR that there's an annual re-enrollment or certification, I don't know what the term is, process that ag landowners have to go through. So that you're proactively, as the owner of an enrolled ag parcel, required to send something in, a postcard, do it online. You have options there, I think. So it might not happen right away. I mean, that's an annual process in August or sometime when it is. But if you bought the parcel earlier than that, you might get the benefit of it for a period of time. But I think it couldn't go on indefinitely, in theory.
Yeah, I forgot about that. That was new a few years ago, but I remember there was some drama about these postcards and people weren't returning them. And yeah.
We changed that, didn't we? Every 3 years, maybe now.
Yeah, we added some time so that it wasn't, quite as onerous. So.
Does anybody know, Greg talked about enrollment and re-enrollment. Is it an easy process, if you go from like, you're the owner and it becomes a trust, for example, is there like a transfer, or you're the owner and you sell it to your children, not arm's length, as opposed to, a true change of ownership and re-enrollment with that, or if it's even a forest block that the plan doesn't change at all. Is there a way to just carry through, like essentially like a fast track re-enrollment?
There are, I know that there are some scenarios where it's easier. Um, let's see if I can quickly find that on PBR's website here, because they do have a page about various types of transfers. I think it's their FAQ, where they go into a lot of those scenarios. Here we go. Wrong FAQ, actually. There we go. No problem. So, yeah, so they have, you can go yourself. I don't need to read this all to you, but there's an FAQ under the current use part of the department's website that discusses various types of transfers and what the process is. So like what happens when an LLC or partnership transfers title to another entity or an individual, and it tells you what you have to do there. What, if you put it into a trust and it's
It seems like
I think
that
first-
would be a good place if it's just continuously agriculture to have something easy too, so
Yeah.
you don't have to go through a complicated re-enrollment process. As long as you're testing every year that it's agricultural.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's something that we could also look at, but I also wanted to flag the 30-day point.
Yeah, I never heard of that.
Just so that we can, maybe if you could, take that piece of statute and highlight the 30 days, we could take testimony from the tax department and anybody else on how they would feel about making that a longer period of time, just so that people aren't tripped up and that if they discover it on the next day, have no recourse. Where we might hear that, that would cause a lot of problems to change that, or we might hear that, yeah, that would be reasonable. And if we can get, also some testimony to suggest that it would be helpful to change it, I think. It's just something to look at.
Okay.
All right, Kirby, thank you very much. And